The morning light broke across the central plains of Luzon on January 17th, 1945, illuminating a sight that would haunt Japanese tank commander Lieutenant Takeo Iwanaka for the few weeks he had left to live. Through the narrow vision slit of his Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha medium tank, he watched American M4 Sherman tanks advancing in a formation so vast it seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. 43 enemy vehicles moved with mechanical precision across terrain where Iwanaka's 22 remaining tanks now sat dug into concealed positions around the village of Lupao. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. For every Japanese tank present, the Americans fielded 2. But the disparity went deeper than simple numbers. Each Sherman carried 75mm guns that could punch through Japanese armor at any range and any angle. Iwanaka's own 47mm cannon could only hope to penetrate a Sherman's side or rear plates at close distance. His tank weighed 14.8 tons. The Sherman's weighed 33. His engine produced 170 horsepower. Theirs generated 400. And the Type 97 had been Japan's finest tank when it entered production in 1938. 7 years later, in the winter of 1945, it was obsolete. Iwanaka understood something that morning that most Japanese commanders would not grasp until weeks or months later. The numbers he faced at Lupao were not an anomaly. They represented a new reality of industrial warfare that Japanese military planning had fundamentally failed to anticipate. The Americans had not simply built more tanks. They had built more tanks than should have been possible. Somewhere across the Pacific, in factories Iwanaka had never seen and could barely imagine, the United States had transformed automobile plants into weapons production facilities that operated on scales beyond Japanese comprehension. The tank he commanded, this Chi-Ha that represented years of Japanese engineering effort and precious steel resources, was one of roughly 6,300 armored vehicles Japan had produced over 15 years of military expansion. The Sherman advancing toward his position was one of 88,000 American tanks built in just 4 years of wartime mobilization. That single statistic contained within it the entire story of how Japan lost the Pacific War before most of its generals even understood they were losing it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not in 1945 on Luzon, but in 1925 in Tokyo, when the Imperial Japanese Army established its first armored force. Japan's military planners, studying the lessons of the Great War in Europe, recognized that modern warfare required mechanized vehicles, but Japan faced constraints that Western powers did not. The home islands possessed limited steel production capacity. Domestic iron ore supplies were inadequate for large-scale industrial mobilization. Japan imported most raw materials from overseas territories or through trade relationships that could be severed by hostile powers. These limitations shaped every decision about tank development and production from the very beginning. Japanese engineers approached tank design with an emphasis on efficiency rather than mass production. The Imperial Japanese Army needed vehicles that could be built with available resources, maintained by soldiers with limited technical training, and operated in the jungles and rice paddies of Asia where Japan planned to fight its wars. Weight restrictions dominated design philosophy. Heavy tanks consumed more steel, required more powerful engines, and strained the capacity of Japanese bridges and roads. The Army prioritized lighter vehicles that could be produced in existing facilities without massive infrastructure investment. The Type 89 medium tank, Japan's first domestically produced tracked combat vehicle, entered service in 1929. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries built it with riveted armor plates and a low-velocity 57mm gun designed for infantry support rather than tank versus tank combat. At 12.8 tons, the Type 89 represented Japanese military industry operating at the limits of its capacity. Production proceeded slowly. Between 1929 and 1937, Japan manufactured just over 400 Type 89 tanks. That worked out to roughly 50 tanks per year, across an 8-year production run. For comparison, the Soviet Union produced approximately 35,000 T-26 light tanks during the same period. France built over 3,000 tanks between 1930 and 1937. Even Germany, constrained by Versailles Treaty limitations until 1935, managed to build and conceal production of nearly 1,000 Panzer I tanks by 1937. Japan's tank production numbers placed it firmly in the second tier of industrial powers, producing enough vehicles to equip a small professional army, but nowhere near enough to sustain mechanized warfare at the scale European powers were preparing for. The Second Sino-Japanese War that erupted in 1937 exposed both the strengths and limitations of Japanese tank doctrine. Against Chinese forces that possessed minimal armor and limited anti-tank capabilities, Japanese tanks proved devastatingly effective. The Type 89 and the newer Type 95 Hago light tank overwhelmed Chinese defensive positions. Japanese tank crews grew confident, even complacent. They faced an enemy described by one American military observer as a medieval mob, poorly equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking any coherent anti-tank doctrine. Japanese commanders developed tactical approaches based on this experience. Tanks operated in small units, supporting infantry advances. Crews trained for breakthrough operations against fortified positions. The emphasis remained on firepower against fixed defenses rather than armor protection against enemy tanks. This made perfect sense, given the opposition Japan faced in China. It would prove catastrophically inadequate against American and Soviet armor. The first warning came in July 1939 at Khalkhin Gol, on the border between Japanese-controlled Manchuria and Soviet-controlled Mongolia. Japanese and Soviet forces clashed in a border dispute that escalated into a full-scale armored battle. Japanese Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks, considered modern and effective, engaged Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 fast tanks. The results shattered Japanese assumptions about their armored forces. Soviet 45mm guns outranged Japanese weapons. Soviet tanks moved faster and hit harder than anything Japanese crews had encountered in China. When the battle ended in September 1939, Japan had lost approximately 135 tanks, destroyed or disabled. Soviet losses were heavier in absolute numbers, but Soviet production capacity meant those tanks could be replaced within weeks. Japanese losses represented a significant portion of the Imperial Army's entire armored force, and replacing them would take months or years. The Khalkhin Gol defeat triggered a comprehensive review of Japanese tank doctrine and design. Engineers recognized that the Type 97's low-velocity 57mm gun lacked penetrating power against modern armor. Development began on a new 47mm weapon with higher muzzle velocity, specifically designed to counter Soviet tanks. This gun entered production as the Type 1 47mm tank gun in 1941. Existing Type 97 tanks received retrofitted turrets mounting the new weapon, creating the Type 97 Shinhoto Chi-Ha variant. The conversion program represented Japanese military industry trying to adapt to changing battlefield realities without the resources to design and produce entirely new vehicles. The Shinhoto Chi-Ha was not a new tank. It was an old tank with a better gun, and the distinction would prove critical. By December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and launched its offensive across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Army fielded approximately 2,000 tanks of all types. Production capacity had increased modestly. Japanese factories built perhaps 400 to 500 tanks per year by 1941, split between light tanks for reconnaissance and medium tanks for infantry support. These production numbers reflected steel allocation priorities that favored the Imperial Japanese Navy. Battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers consumed the vast majority of Japan's steel production. The Navy enjoyed institutional priority within Japan's military structure. Admiral Yamamoto's carriers received steel that might otherwise have built tanks. The decision made strategic sense within Japan's war planning. The Pacific War would be decided by naval battles, or so Japanese leadership believed. Control of the sea lanes would determine access to resources and the ability to project military power across oceanic distances. Tanks mattered primarily for land campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, secondary theaters compared to the decisive naval confrontation. Japan expected to fight against the United States. Japanese military planners allocated resources accordingly. The combined fleet received modern warships. The army made do with what remained. That this resource allocation reflected deeper assumptions about how the Pacific War would unfold. Japanese leadership expected a short conflict. The initial offensive would seize oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, rubber plantations in Malaya, and strategic positions throughout Southeast Asia. These conquests would make Japan self-sufficient in critical resources. American forces, shocked by Japanese successes and facing a two-ocean war against both Japan and Germany, would negotiate a settlement recognizing Japan's new empire. The war would end before American industrial capacity could fully mobilize. These assumptions permeated every aspect of Japanese military planning. The army did not need thousands of tanks because Japanese forces would not be fighting sustained ground campaigns against mechanized opponents. The initial conquests would be achieved with existing forces, and subsequent operations would primarily involve garrison duties and small-scale counterinsurgency operations. Tank production could remain modest because demand would remain limited. The assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, the Bat-AN campaign in the Philippines demonstrated that American forces would fight far longer and harder than Japanese intelligence had predicted. The Midway disaster in June 1942 destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and eliminated much of Japan's trained naval aviation cadre. American counteroffensives at Guadalcanal in August 1942 caught Japanese forces unprepared for sustained combat at the end of extended supply lines. By the end of 1942, the short victorious war Japanese planners had envisioned had transformed into an attritional struggle that Japan's industrial base could not sustain. But adjusting tank production at this point required resources that no longer existed. Steel allocations could not be shifted away from naval construction without abandoning damaged warships and unfinished vessels. Factories could not be retooled for different production without interrupting existing output. The decision tree that had led to modest tank production numbers in 1941 locked Japan into production limitations it could not escape in 1942 or 43. American tank production followed an entirely different trajectory, shaped by entirely different constraints. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the American military possessed exactly 0 domestically designed tanks. American forces fighting in France in 1918 operated French-designed Renault FT light tanks. After the war, the United States Army maintained a small, armored force, primarily for experimental purposes. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, American tank development proceeded slowly, limited by peacetime military budgets and isolationist political sentiment. By 1939, total American tank production since the end of World War I amounted to fewer than 400 vehicles. The United States appeared to lag far behind European powers in armored warfare development. This assessment was technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. It confused existing military production with potential industrial capacity. The United States, in 1939, possessed something no other nation could match: the American automotive industry. Detroit's factories built millions of cars and trucks annually using assembly line techniques pioneered by Henry Ford and refined by General Motors and Chrysler. These plants employed hundreds of thousands of workers skilled in metal fabrication, engine assembly, and mass production logistics. The infrastructure existed to produce vehicles at scales that European or Asian factories could not approach. American automobile production in 1941 exceeded 3 million vehicles. The entire German automotive industry produced roughly 300,000 military and civilian vehicles that same year. Japan's vehicle production totaled perhaps 50,000 units. The disparity in existing production capacity was already 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 in America's favor before any conversion to military production began. When President Franklin Roosevelt called for dramatic increases in military production in May 1940, he was not asking American industry to build capabilities it lacked. He was asking it to redirect capabilities it already possessed. The challenge was not whether American factories could build tanks. The challenge was how quickly existing automobile plants could be converted to tank production and how rapidly that production could scale up. The answer came faster than even American military planners anticipated. On August 28, 1940, the Chrysler Corporation received a contract to produce 1,000 M3 medium tanks. The design was still being finalized when the contract was signed. Chrysler had never built a tank, but Chrysler knew how to build complex vehicles using assembly line methods, and that expertise transferred directly to tank production. Construction began on the Detroit tank arsenal in the winter of 1940 to 41 on 113 acres of farmland in Warren, Michigan, just north of Detroit. The facility was designed by architect Albert Kahn as a purpose-built tank factory, 5 city blocks deep and 2 blocks wide, with assembly lines modeled on automotive production but scaled for 30-ton tracked vehicles. The first M3 tank rolled off the production line on April 24, 1941, while construction on parts of the plant was still underway. By December 7, 1941, when the United States officially entered World War II, the Detroit tank arsenal was already producing tanks. Production accelerated through 1942. By December of that year, the arsenal's 5,000 workers produced 896 Sherman tanks in a single month. That monthly output exceeded Japan's total annual tank production. A single American factory, operating in a city hundreds of miles from any coast, built more tanks in 4 weeks than the entire Japanese military-industrial complex produced in 12 months. The Detroit tank arsenal represented just one facility among many. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc, Michigan, built Sherman tanks. The Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio converted from locomotive production to tank manufacturing. The Pacific Car and Foundry Company in Washington State, the Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, the Baldwin Locomotive Works, the American Locomotive Company, the Federal Machine and Welder Company, dozens of facilities across the United States converted to tank production or began building tank components. The scale of American production reflected industrial capacity that existed before the war began. Detroit had not built massive new steel mills or trained entire workforces from scratch. It had redirected existing capabilities toward military production. The results were tanks produced at rates that seemed impossible to observers who did not understand American automotive industry's pre-existing scale. Japanese intelligence officers tracking American production capabilities focused on what they could observe directly. They counted ships visible in American ports. They estimated aircraft based on reported deliveries to British forces. They calculated industrial output based on known factory locations and estimated capacity. What they could not observe was the rapid expansion of production that occurred outside their intelligence-gathering reach. The Detroit tank arsenal sat far from any coastline, protected by thousands of miles of American territory that Japanese reconnaissance aircraft could never reach. Intelligence officers knew the facility existed from pre-war records, but they had no way to observe its expansion, measure its output, or understand that it represented just one factory among dozens producing tanks at unprecedented rates. The intelligence failure began with cultural assumptions about industrial organization. Japanese tank production centered on a small number of facilities operated by companies like Mitsubishi and Hitachi. These factories built tanks from the ground up, fabricating components in-house using skilled craftsmen who had spent years learning their trades. Production increased incrementally as workers gained experience and as additional resources became available. This approach made sense within Japan's industrial structure. It was also the only approach Japanese intelligence officers understood. They assumed American tank production would follow similar patterns. American factories would build up production capacity gradually. Worker training would take months or years. New facilities would require extensive construction time before beginning output. These assumptions led to production estimates that were catastrophically low. By mid-1943, American tank production had reached levels that Japanese intelligence analysts dismissed as impossible propaganda. Reports filtering through neutral countries suggested the United States had built over 20,000 tanks since entering the war. Japanese military staff officers reviewing these figures concluded they must be exaggerated by a factor of 3 or 4. No industrial economy could possibly produce armored vehicles at such rates. The steel requirements alone would exceed what Japanese analysts believed American mills could manufacture while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, and artillery. The reports had to be American psychological warfare designed to demoralize Japanese forces and inflate perceptions of American strength. This dismissal of accurate intelligence reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how American industry operated. The Sherman tank that became the workhorse of American armored forces embodied principles of mass production that Japanese tank designers had never considered. The M4 Sherman was not an engineering masterpiece. Its armor was adequate but not exceptional. Its 75mm gun was effective but not the most powerful weapon available. Its reliability was good but not perfect. What made the Sherman devastating was that American factories could build it in enormous quantities using standardized parts and simplified assembly processes. A Sherman contained approximately 20,000 individual components. The Detroit tank arsenal broke down the manufacturing process into specialized tasks that could be performed by workers with minimal training. Women who had never worked in factories before the war operated welding equipment and assembly tools after just a few weeks of instruction. The emphasis was on volume rather than individual perfection. Japanese tank production followed entirely different principles. The Type 97 Chi-Ha was built by skilled craftsmen who hand-fitted components and made adjustments during assembly. Each tank was slightly different because manufacturing tolerances were wider and final fitting required individual attention. This produced reliable vehicles, but it meant production rates remained limited by the availability of skilled workers who could not be rapidly replaced if lost to combat or other wartime demands. When Japan lost experienced workers to military service or factory accidents, production declined because replacing them required years of training. When America lost workers, replacement workers entered the production line within weeks and maintained output levels with minimal interruption. The difference extended to supply chains and logistics. American Sherman production used interchangeable parts manufactured to tight tolerances. A transmission built in Detroit could be installed in a tank assembled in California. A damaged Sherman in the Pacific could receive replacement parts shipped from any factory in the United States. Japanese tanks lacked this interchangeability. Parts from different production runs often required modification before installation. Field maintenance became complicated because repair crews needed skilled machinists who could adapt components rather than simple mechanics who could swap standardized parts. This meant Japanese tank units in the field gradually lost operational vehicles to mechanical failures that could not be repaired with available resources. American units maintained higher operational readiness because broken tanks could be quickly returned to service with replacement parts. By 1944, the cumulative effect of these production differences had created a disparity so vast it distorted strategic calculations on both sides. The United States had produced approximately 60,000 tanks. Japan had produced perhaps 5,000 total since beginning its armored forces program in the 1920s. American monthly production exceeded Japanese annual output by factors of 3 or 4. But Japanese military leadership still did not grasp the full scope of the production gap because intelligence services lacked both the access to gather accurate data and the conceptual framework to believe such data if it arrived. The numbers seemed too large to be real, so they were dismissed as propaganda or miscalculation. The reality became undeniable in January 1945 when American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf on Luzon in the Philippines. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, had prepared defensive positions designed to bleed American forces in prolonged jungle fighting. He possessed one strategic asset that previous Japanese defensive campaigns had lacked. The 2nd Tank Division, with 220 tanks, represented the largest concentration of Japanese armor committed to a single battle in the Pacific War. Yamashita's staff had calculated that American forces invading Luzon might field perhaps 60 or 70 tanks, based on intelligence estimates of typical American divisional organizations. The 2nd Tank Division's 220 vehicles would give Japan local armored superiority, allowing counterattacks that could disrupt American advances and inflict casualties that might force a negotiated settlement. The calculation was based on intelligence estimates that were 18 months out of date and had been fundamentally flawed even when originally compiled. American forces landing at Lingayen Gulf brought substantially more than 70 tanks. The 6th Army that came ashore between January 9th and 15th, 1945, included multiple tank battalions with over 500 armored vehicles. These were not the total American armor strength in the Pacific. They were simply the tanks allocated to this one invasion of this one island. Behind them, in depots throughout the Pacific, sat reserve vehicles that could replace combat losses within days. Behind those reserves, American factories continued producing hundreds of tanks monthly that would arrive in theater within weeks of completion. Major General Innis Swift, commanding I Corps on the American northern flank, worried about Japanese armor despite the numerical advantage his forces enjoyed. Intelligence reports indicated the 2nd Tank Division was somewhere in central Luzon, but exact locations remained uncertain. Swift held additional tank battalions in reserve, concerned that Japanese forces might concentrate their armor for a massive counterattack that could overwhelm forward American units. The caution reflected American respect for Japanese tactical skill and fighting spirit. It also reflected the American approach to warfare that emphasized overwhelming material superiority. If Japanese forces might attack with 200 tanks, American doctrine called for holding 400 in the operational area to ensure victory. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could afford to lose half its forces and still win the battle. The Japanese 2nd Tank Division never executed the massed armored assault Yamashita had envisioned. American forces advanced too quickly through terrain unsuitable for large-scale tank operations. Filipino guerrillas provided intelligence that allowed American commanders to avoid Japanese strongpoints. Airstrikes and artillery bombardments destroyed Japanese tanks before they could concentrate for offensive operations. The division fought in small packets, company-sized units trying to block American advances or defend key road junctions. The tank battle Japanese planners had hoped would demonstrate the effectiveness of their armor instead became a grinding attrition that favored the side with unlimited replacement capacity. On January 17th, at the village of Lupao, elements of the 2nd Tank Division made their stand. Lieutenant Iwanaka's company had dug their tanks into concealed positions, turrets barely visible above ground level, waiting for American forces to advance into kill zones where Japanese guns might penetrate Sherman armor. The tactic was sound. The execution was professional. It didn't matter. American forces attacked with methodical patience, using infantry to locate Japanese positions, artillery to suppress them, and tanks to destroy them with direct fire from ranges where Japanese guns could not effectively respond. The battle lasted 9 hours. When it ended, 10 Japanese tanks lay destroyed in front of American positions. Iwanaka survived with half his company. They withdrew during darkness, leaving behind tanks too damaged to move and crews too wounded to fight. Similar engagements repeated across central Luzon throughout late January and February. Japanese tankers fought with skill and desperate courage. They achieved local tactical successes, destroying individual Sherman tanks and inflicting casualties on American infantry. But every Japanese tank lost was irreplaceable. Every Sherman destroyed was replaced within days by another vehicle shipped from American depots. The mathematics were inexorable. The 2nd Tank Division entered the Luzon campaign with 220 operational tanks. By the end of February, fewer than 30 remained capable of movement. American tank strength on Luzon, despite losses, remained above 400 vehicles because replacement tanks arrived continuously from supply lines that stretched back to factories in Michigan and California. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The destruction of Japanese armor on Luzon occurred simultaneously with American armored operations across the Pacific. On Iwo Jima, in February and March 1945, American Marines landed with tank support that overwhelmed Japanese defenders. On Okinawa, between April and June, 8 American tanks battalions, with approximately 800 vehicles, faced 14 Japanese tanks from an understrength regiment. The disparity had become so extreme that Japanese forces essentially abandoned tank versus tank combat in favor of using their remaining armor as static pillboxes, dug into defensive positions where at least their guns could fire at American forces, even if the vehicles themselves could not maneuver. Japanese tank crews understood their strategic situation with brutal clarity by the spring of 1945. They faced an enemy who could lose tanks at rates that would cripple Japanese forces, and then replace those losses faster than the battles that destroyed them. American supply ships brought not just replacement tanks, but replacement parts, ammunition, fuel, and even replacement crews. The logistical system supporting American armor operations represented industrial capacity operating at scales Japanese logistics had never achieved. A Sherman that threw a track could be repaired in hours by maintenance crews with ready access to spare parts. A Chi-Ha with similar damage often remained disabled for days or weeks, waiting for components that had to be fabricated or scavenged from other vehicles. The industrial disparity extended beyond simple production numbers to every aspect of armored warfare. American tankers trained on equipment identical to what they would use in combat. Training facilities in the United States had hundreds of tanks available for instruction because production capacity exceeded immediate combat needs. Japanese tanker training suffered from equipment shortages that forced crews to learn on obsolete vehicles or share limited numbers of modern tanks. American crews arrived in combat theaters with hundreds of hours of training time. Japanese replacement crews by 1945 often had minimal instruction because fuel shortages and equipment scarcity prevented adequate training. The few Japanese officers who survived the Luzon campaign and reached safety in the mountains of northern Luzon carried with them a recognition that altered their understanding of the war. They had not been defeated by superior tactics or better soldiers. They had been defeated by an industrial system that produced weapons faster than they could destroy them. Every tactical victory Japanese forces achieved was negated within days by American material superiority. You could ambush and destroy an American tank platoon and find 2 more platoons arriving the following week. The Americans fought as if individual battles didn't matter, because from an industrial perspective, they didn't. Losing 50 tanks in a month was acceptable if you could build 100 to replace them. Japanese military leadership in Tokyo received reports throughout early 1945 describing American armored strength in terms that finally conveyed the true scale of the production disparity. Intelligence assessments compiled in March and April 1945, drawing on observations from multiple battlefields, estimated American tank production might have reached 70 to 80,000 vehicles since 1941. These numbers were finally taken seriously because they came from battlefield observations rather than pre-war estimates. Japanese commanders who had personally witnessed American operations reported tank concentrations that exceeded anything Japanese industry could produce. The intelligence services could no longer dismiss these reports as exaggerated because they came from credible observers describing specific encounters. The recognition came too late to alter Japan's strategic position. By April 1945, American forces controlled the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and were fighting on Okinawa, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands. American B-29 bombers operating from captured airfields systematically destroyed Japanese cities and industrial facilities. The American submarine campaign had severed maritime supply routes that connected Japan with resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. Steel production, already inadequate before the war, had collapsed under the weight of bombing campaigns and raw material shortages. Japanese factories that might have produced tanks no longer had electricity, steel, or workers. The Type 3 Chi-Nu medium tank represented Japan's attempt to develop armor capable of engaging American Shermans on equal terms. The Chi-Nu mounted a 75mm gun that could penetrate Sherman armor at combat ranges. Its frontal armor was thick enough to resist some American weapons. It incorporated lessons learned from 3 years of combat against American forces. Engineers completed the design in 1944. Production began in late 1944 and continued into 1945. Total production reached approximately 166 vehicles. Every single one remained in Japan, held in reserve for the defense of the home islands against the American invasion that military planners expected, but which never came. The Chi-Nu program illustrated the impossibility of Japan's situation by mid-1945. Japanese engineers could design tanks comparable to American vehicles. They understood the technical requirements. They possessed the theoretical knowledge. What they lacked was the industrial capacity to produce such tanks in meaningful numbers while simultaneously maintaining aircraft production, ship construction, ammunition manufacturing, and all the other demands of total war. The United States could build both Sherman tanks and heavy bombers and artillery pieces and cargo ships because American industrial capacity exceeded the combined requirements of all these production programs. Japan had to choose between tanks and aircraft, between ammunition and ships, between weapons and the steel mills that produced the raw materials for weapons. Every choice meant something essential was not produced. Japanese tank production in 1945 essentially ceased. Factories allocated to armored vehicle manufacturing shifted to producing other weapons considered more critical for homeland defense. The few tanks still being built were simple designs using whatever materials remained available. Quality declined as skilled workers were conscripted into military service and replaced by inexperienced personnel. The 2nd Tank Division, destroyed on Luzon, was never reconstituted. The tanks held in Japan for defensive operations remained dispersed in concealed positions, waiting for an invasion that would be rendered unnecessary by atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the war. The final accounting revealed the complete scope of the production failure that had doomed Japan's ground forces. Between 1930 and 1945, Japan produced approximately 6,300 tanks of all types. This total included light tanks, medium tanks, tankettes, and self-propelled guns built on tank chassis. It represented 15 years of production by a military-industrial complex that devoted substantial resources to armored vehicle development. The United States, in just 4 years between 1941 and 1945, produced 88,000 tanks and tank destroyers. A single American factory, the Detroit Tank Arsenal, built 22,000 tanks, more than 3 times Japan's total production across all factories for the entire war. The numerical disparity was 14-1 in America's favor, and that ratio understated the real gap because American tanks were generally heavier, better armed, and more reliable than their Japanese counterparts. The disparity shattered every assumption that had guided Japanese military planning since the decision to go to war in December 1941. Japanese strategists had understood that America possessed greater industrial potential. They had calculated that Japan's early victories would secure resources necessary to sustain a long war. They had believed Japanese tactical excellence and fighting spirit would offset American material advantages. All of these assumptions rested on a belief that the gap between Japanese and American production capacity, while significant, remained manageable. Japan might produce one tank for every 2 or 3 American tanks, but superior Japanese tactics and crew training would balance the equation. The reality was that Japan produced one tank for every 14 American tanks, and no amount of tactical skill could overcome such overwhelming material inferiority. Lieutenant Takeo Iwanaka died on February 4, 1945, when American artillery fire destroyed his tank during a withdrawal north of San Jose. His crew burned with their vehicle, one of dozens of Japanese tanks lost that day. The Americans continued their advance without pausing. The Shermans that killed Iwanaka were replaced within 72 hours by fresh vehicles brought forward from supply depots. The pattern repeated across every battlefield where Japanese and American forces clashed. Japanese units fought until they were destroyed, then ceased to exist because no replacements were available. American units fought until they were worn down, then were reinforced and returned to combat because the supply line never stopped delivering fresh equipment. The broader lessons extended beyond tanks to every dimension of industrial warfare. Japan entered World War II with armed forces designed for limited wars against regional opponents. The Imperial Army and Navy were professional, skilled, and equipped with modern weapons adequate for conflicts in China or Southeast Asia. They were not equipped for total war against an opponent whose peacetime consumer economy produced more vehicles annually than Japan's entire military-industrial complex built in a decade. The assumption that tactical excellence and fighting spirit could compensate for industrial inferiority might have been valid if the gap had been 2-1 or even 3-1. At 14-1, it became irrelevant. American planners understood this mathematics of industrial warfare from the beginning. When President Roosevelt called for producing 88,000 tanks in May 1940, the number was not chosen randomly. It represented a calculation of what American industry could build and what would be required to achieve overwhelming material superiority on every battlefield. German tank production would peak at approximately 27,000 vehicles for the entire war. Soviet production would reach over 80,000 tanks, matching American output, but under circumstances that nearly destroyed the Soviet state. American production of 88,000 tanks occurred while simultaneously building the world's largest navy, producing 300,000 aircraft, manufacturing millions of trucks and artillery pieces, and supplying Allied forces worldwide with equipment and supplies. The industrial triumph that produced 88,000 American tanks emerged from capabilities that existed before the war began. Detroit's automotive factories, capable of building millions of cars annually using assembly line methods, simply redirected those capabilities toward military production. The workforce, the factories, the supply chains, the management expertise all existed in 1939. Converting them to tank production required neither creating industrial capacity from nothing nor training workforces from scratch. It required redirecting existing capabilities, and American industry accomplished that redirection faster and more completely than Japanese intelligence had believed possible. The result was military production that overwhelmed every opponent through sheer material abundance. The Type 97 Chi-Ha tanks that remained operational by summer 1945 sat dispersed across the Japanese home islands, dug into defensive positions where their crews waited for an invasion that never materialized. These vehicles represented Japan's tank production effort across nearly a decade. The final Japanese tank, built during World War II, rolled off a production line in July 1945, one vehicle among the 166 Chi-Nu tanks that constituted Japan's last tank production program. That same month, American factories were producing hundreds of tanks that would never see combat because the war would end before they reached the Pacific Theater. The disparity between 6,300 and 88,000 told the story of how industrial capacity determined modern warfare outcomes regardless of tactical skill or strategic vision. Japanese military officers who survived the war and were interrogated by American occupation forces expressed genuine shock when informed of actual American production figures. Many initially refused to believe the numbers. 88,000 tanks seemed impossible. No nation could produce armored vehicles at such rates while also building ships and aircraft and supporting ground forces across multiple theaters. The numbers had to be exaggerated or miscounted. When American interrogators provided detailed breakdowns of production by factory and year, Japanese officers struggled to reconcile the figures with their understanding of industrial capacity. The concept that the United States had converted automobile factories into tank plants producing thousands of vehicles monthly simply did not align with Japanese experience of industrial mobilization. One Japanese tank officer stated during interrogation that if someone had told him during the war that America would build 88,000 tanks, he would have considered it propaganda too absurd to merit serious consideration. The failure to anticipate or comprehend American industrial capacity had strategic consequences that extended far beyond tanks. If Japanese intelligence had accurately estimated American production capabilities in 1941, the decision to attack Pearl Harbor might have been reconsidered. War with the United States made strategic sense only if Japanese leaders believed they could achieve quick victories and force a negotiated peace before American industry fully mobilized. If Japanese strategists had understood that American factories would produce tanks at 14 times Japanese rates, aircraft at even higher multiples, and ships in quantities that would replace every vessel Japan could sink before the wreckage cooled, the entire logic of going to war collapsed. You cannot win an attritional conflict against an opponent who can replace losses 14 times faster than you can inflict them. The cultural and institutional factors that prevented accurate intelligence assessment remain subjects of historical analysis. Japanese military culture emphasized spirit over material, believing that fighting will and tactical excellence could overcome industrial disadvantages. This belief system made it psychologically difficult to accept intelligence suggesting overwhelming material inferiority. Intelligence officers who reported data indicating massive American production advantages risked being dismissed as defeatist. The institutional incentives rewarded optimistic assessments that supported existing war plans rather than pessimistic evaluations that questioned strategic assumptions. These cultural biases meant that even when accurate intelligence reached Japanese military headquarters, it was filtered through assumptions that distorted its meaning. The arithmetic remained brutal and undeniable. 6,300 tanks could not defeat 88,000 tanks. Tactical excellence could not overcome 14-to-1 material disadvantages. Fighting spirit could not substitute for steel and assembly lines. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, which represented years of Japanese engineering effort and consumed scarce resources in its production, was obsolete before it entered combat, not because of design flaws, but because American factories built better tanks faster than Japanese factories could build any tanks at all. Lieutenant Iwanaka's fate was sealed not by tactical decisions on Luzon, but by industrial capacity calculations that were finalized years before he climbed into his tank for the last time. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.